Okay, so the next lady I would like to tell you about is called Isobel Wylie Hutchison, and she was a Scotswoman, and she was born in West Lothian near Edinburgh in 1889. And again, she was a very talented young girl. She was artistic. She could draw and paint. She could write. She loved writing poetry. She was born into a very supportive family, quite a well-to-do family. And she had two brothers, two sisters. And again, even though she was growing up, I suppose this is slightly later than some of the women that we've already talked about, it was still very much expected of women at that time that although they certain parts of education were open to them. I mean, for example, Isabel's sisters went off to universities to study. So that was actually available to women at that time. It was still expected that women would generally settle down, have children, and do the traditional things that women were expected to do. Isobel very quietly decided that she wasn't going to do that. So she didn't openly rebel and make a fuss about it. She just studied, she read books about the places where she wanted to go, and she took herself in very easy stages to places that were gradually more and more challenging. So as she was growing up, she developed an interest in botany, in horticulture. So she actually studied at a horticultural college in Britain to give herself a kind of background in botany. Actually, this gave her a passport to travel. It gave her a good reason to travel, because especially for solo women at that time, it was a good thing to actually have a valid reason, a professional reason to travel. And so Isobel decided that botany was going to be her profession. Once she'd done that and become qualified, she took herself first of all to places like Norway, then Iceland, and then one of her most, well, really her first most ambitious expedition was in 1927 to Greenland. Now, Greenland at that time was a kind of closed country. It was ruled by Denmark, and unless you had a very valid reason to go to Greenland, you wouldn't really be allowed to go. So in other words, if it was going to be a research project, maybe you were going to work there for a few years, otherwise you really wouldn't get permission. So Isobel, of course, when applying to go to Greenland, was able to give botany as her subject for going, as her reason for going. And that's how she managed to get to Greenland as a solo traveller. So she arrived in Greenland in 1927. To the best of our knowledge, she was probably the first Scotswoman ever to set foot in Greenland. And what she did first of all, because again, she did it in quite easy stages, she stayed on the east coast, the southeast coast of Greenland, and travelled down towards the tip, basically just meeting people, collecting plant specimens for museums back home, because that was her primary object. But also she was painting. She was painting the landscapes that she saw. She was making portraits of the people that she met. And she was also taking photographs and making films. Plus, she was writing poetry. So all these creative ways that she was reflecting what she saw. And what was interesting about Isobel was that instead of just recording things in a very scientific way and then coming back and examining the findings, she was talking to the people that she met. She was curious about their social structure, about their culture, and about their traditions and customs and beliefs. So she was talking to the women of Greenland, probably in a way that they hadn't really been talked to before. She was curious, but not in a threatening way. Isobel had this lovely attitude to life. She kind of brought joy with her. She brought a kind of delight in exploration. And instead of just sort of saving this pleasure for herself, it was almost as if she spread it, and she created joy just by being there. And you can see it on the faces of the people that she met, because for some of the places where she wanted to go, she needed help. So she just for example, she employed a team of Greenlanders to take her up the fjords to places where you wouldn't normally go, to see these groves of trees, just for example. And that was about a week of exploration, being rowed up the fjord, staying, camping, cooking some fish, camping under the stars. And the absolute pleasure that you can see in Isobel's photographs, on not just on her face, but in the faces of all the people that were with her. They are having a whale of a time. And she was recording all their experiences. She was going to these ancient sites that were these ruins of Norse monasteries, just for example. And she was just absorbing the whole experience. For Isobel, it was not just about the flowers, although that was a huge part of it. It was about recording the culture and the customs and the stories of the people, you know, the myths that they had in their culture. And there was a real exchange going on because, of course, she came from Scotland. You know, she was steeped in the myths and the legends of Scotland and the poetry of Scotland. So they had this real exchange of cultures. And then when she went back to Greenland in 1928, she actually stayed there for a whole year. So she stayed there throughout the Arctic winter. And she began to learn their language, and she began to communicate properly with them on a much deeper level. And she really came to love them. And so what happened with Isobel was that when she came back, I mean, she always came back to Scotland after her travels. And she wrote books, she wrote articles, but she kept in touch with these people that she'd met in the Arctic for the rest of her life. And they would always remember her. And so there was this wonderful relationship going on. And then having come back from Greenland, her next most ambitious step was to take herself off to Alaska and Arctic Canada in 1933. And again, that was solo. You know, she basically just packed an awful lot of trunks and a lot of food supplies and got herself on a ship across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, up the western seaboard of America, and then inland, down the rivers of Alaska, down the Yukon, and as far as Nome on the coast, and then by boat, right up round past Barrow into the high Arctic. And from there, because there were it was not possible, this is a very short version of her story, it was not possible to go any further by boat because the winter was coming, the sea was freezing. She travelled by dog sled right the way across, so the shore of the Beaufort Sea, frozen sea, across by dog sled as far as the Mackenzie River Delta. And again, she was putting herself in a position where when she got back home, potentially she could have some explaining to do, because she was, just for example, she was sharing a very small cabin with a guy who was about her age. He was an Estonian-born fur trapper and trader. And in effect, he was really the male counterpart of Isobel. You know, they'd almost sort of met their twin, as it were. And they had this wonderful friendship for about 6 or 7 weeks, cut off from the outside world by the weather. And he was the one who was in charge of the dog team. It was his dog team that took her on to her next port of call and then back down to where she was going to fly back and get a ship home to Britain. And so, of course, she was very much aware of where she was putting herself at that time and the potential impact of what she'd done when she got back home. And again, she was writing about it, but in such a way that nobody thought anything of it. You know, she came back and she was celebrated for what she'd done. And so when she came to RSGS, and that was in 1934, she received the Mungo Park Medal, which is a very prestigious medal. It's still given to people who put themselves in the line of danger for the explorations that they do. And she gave talks to the society. She was very popular as a lecturer. We've still got a lot of her images here in the archives. We've got a painting by Isobel, and she was honorary editor of the Scottish Geographical magazine, and she was also a vice president of the society for pretty much the rest of her life. So we do love Isobel, and I absolutely love her story. And again, it is so inspirational because she trusted to She trusted to good fortune instead of planning out her journeys meticulously. I mean, there was a certain amount of planning, but instead of planning everything and trying to keep to it rigorously, she just trusted, because she had a very strong faith, that if she hit a problem, a solution would come along very soon. And it never failed her, ever. She always found something would turn up and it would get her out of a problem and into something better. And that was really how a lot of her happiest experiences happened. And you can tell through her writing, you know, if you read any of her books, she's the most inspirational woman. You know, it just comes through in her writing.